All right, thank you all. Yes, it's bright and early, 6:30 in the morning in Mississippi and Estados Unidos. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm very humble and looking forward to speaking with you about this important topic of risk factors and early life course prevention among Latino and Latina youth. And once again, thank you for the introduction. And I am a chair and professor in the Department of Criminal Justice and Legal Studies at the University of Mississippi. I have worked at Texas State University and also University of South Florida previously. And so the focus today, as I mentioned, is on Latina early life course risk and protective factors and evidence-based crime prevention. So the focus of the presentation will center around these key concepts in terms of obviously the population being Latinas, focusing primarily on children and young adolescents, and identifying different risk factors, but also protective factors for delinquency and violence, and then kind of close out the presentation on the intersection of risk and protective factors that feed into the prevention and intervention strategies. So I'm going to lead the presentation with a series of studies that I've been involved in from the Berequa Youth Study. The Berequa Youth Study, or the BYS, as it's referred to in an acronym, is one of the only epidemiological studies and data sets that exist in the world that actually follow the same Latino-Latina subgroup, being Puerto Ricans in this case, that were born and raised in two different geographical contexts. So these youth were either born in the Bronx, New York, in the United States, or were born in San Juan in Puerto Rico. And they matched these children up based on demographic factors and first interviewed them in 2002 when these youth were ages anywhere from the range of 5 to 13. And then they were interviewed and their parents were interviewed in a series of 3 annual waves. So in 2002, 3, and then 2004. And so the total sample size for this study is 2,491. So it's also a very large sample size for a study of this kind. And once again, you have the sample of the Puerto Rican youth in the Bronx, 1,138 youth ages 5 to 13, with a matched sample of 1,353 Puerto Rican youth that were born and raised and socialized in San Juan, Puerto Rico. The 3 studies that I'll briefly highlight. The first study is analyzing the trajectories of delinquency. The second study looks at delinquency and victimization, or also referred to and measured as exposure to violence, and how delinquency and victimization overlap in the trajectories. And then the third study looks at the cumulative effect of risk and protective factors on violence. So here's an analysis, it's called a trajectory analysis. So basically what this means is that the assumption is that there's not one kind of offender or one kind of offenders as a group. The idea that over the life course, different groups of individuals offend at different times, different ages, and at different rates. And so using a trajectory analysis, you can identify interesting and useful subgroups with different developmental patterns of offending within the same data. So applying the trajectory analysis to the San Juan sample from the Berequa Youth Study, you identify 4 different groups of delinquents, starting from, once again, and then followed over time from wave 1, 2, and 3. You see the delinquency scores on the left, which range from 0 to 12. This was a self-reported delinquency scale. So youth were asked a number of questions such as, have you ever thrown rocks? Have you ever gotten into fights? Have you ever vandalized property? and they would just report yes or no. And those answers were added up to create a delinquency score. So you have group 1, which is the group at the very bottom, which essentially are the non-offenders or the non-delinquents. They don't have any delinquent activity over those 3 annual surveys. Moving up the chart, you have a group that's kind of a very low rate delinquent group that averages just under 1 crime or 1 delinquent act reported a year. Moving up from them, you have a kind of a moderate rate group that averages around 2.5 delinquent acts per year. And then you have your high rate group. The high rate group averages almost 11 delinquent acts, or 1 a month, in the first wave, declines, precipitously by wave 2, but still has a fairly high rate throughout the 3 waves of observation. But importantly, this is a small group, consisting of a small percent of the sample, around 5%, but they're responsible for a lot of the crime. Comparatively, when you analyze the data using a trajectory analysis for the Bronx sample of Puerto Rican youth, you also, importantly, you find 5 groups relative to the 4 groups in San Juan. You still find the group 1, which are the non-delinquents. You still find group 2 above them, which are the very low rate delinquents. You also find group 3, which are the moderate rate delinquents. Similarly, you find group 4 that starts high, averaging around 5 delinquent acts in a year, and declines noticeably by wave 2, like you saw in the San Juan case. But then you have group 5, which averages around 6 delinquent acts, escalates to over 7 by wave 2, and continues to escalate by over 8 by wave 3. So this is also obviously a high rate delinquent group, or a chronic delinquent group, similar to the San Juan group 4. They were also a small percent of the sample, but they're responsible for a large amount of the delinquent acts reported by the groups. So here's an interesting figure. Sorry for all the statistics and coefficients. That's what we do. Don't worry about the specific numbers. But what you're looking at here is, on the left you have a bunch of risk factors listed, as far as gender, age, parents' use of coercive disciplining, sensation seeking or impulsive type of youth, the negative school environment. You have delinquent peers. You have whether they have positive relationships with their peers. And then you have an element of cultural stress. So this model, you have offending on the right, at the top right, and then bottom right, you see victimization. So this model, usually you try to predict offending by itself, or you try to predict victimization by itself. This model allows you to simultaneously predict both outcomes, offending and victimization or exposure to violence, using the same set of core risk factors. And by all these paths that you're seeing in this structural equation model, you see that all the risk factors, by and large, also have direct, positive, and significant paths to both outcomes, offending and victimization. So that's interesting, because that means you have a shared risk and protective factors for both outcomes. But the most important takeaway point from this model is the dashed line that moves downward from offending to victimization, with the coefficient at 0.438 and the little superscript 1 next to it with the 3 asterisks next to it. What this is what's commonly called the overlap coefficient, the victim offender overlap coefficient. It's positive and significant and robust, which means that with all these risk and protective factors over here on the left, you still cannot explain away the intrinsic link and association between offending and exposure to violence. Because if that dashed line was not there, it means the risk factors explain the reason why offending and exposure to violence are related. But it's not the case. Above and beyond the risk factors, there is still this association between offending and exposure to violence. Now I've shown you here in the third study, basically risk and protective factors for youth generally, but certainly for Latino and Latina youth, can largely be categorized in several what we call risk protective factor domains. I've taken the liberty to highlight and identify the risk factors in red font with the protective factors in blue font. And I've shown you the percentages of the youth who have those risk factors that are engaged in violence on the right side with the wave 1, 2, and 3. So for example, the risk factor domain of individual risk and protective factors, youth who have pro-delinquent attitudes or attitudes and definitions favorable to delinquency, for example, on wave 1, 77.9% of those youth were also involved in violence. Similarly, neglect, those youth who were neglected early on in the life course, 9.4% of those youth reported involvement in violence. And then comparatively, for the protective factor, those youth who were not sexually abused, 95% of those youth reported no involvement in violence. So you see the inverse there. So protective factors means obviously protective from delinquency. Risk means increases your likelihood for delinquency. Then there's the other risk factor domains of family. So poverty, those that are from households in poverty, 33.6% in wave 1, for example, reported violence. Those that have an unemployed head of household, 44.6% reported involvement in violence, for example. And then moving into the other domain, peer risk factors, delinquent peers. This is a strong and robust risk factor, which is obviously not surprising to all of you. Those youth who have friends that engage in delinquent activity, almost 60% of those youth report involvement in violence. Exposure to violence, moving into school or neighborhood risk factors. That's a very robust risk factor. Over 64.2% of youth who report exposure to violence or victimization also report involvement in perpetration of violence. You have another category of risk factors and protective factors, biological and neurodevelopmental. Those youth who, excuse me, who had prenatal complications, 27.1% report involvement in violence. Similar results for perinatal complications. And then you move to the last category of risk and protective factor domains, which are ethnic specific or cultural specific, which are unique to Latina youth. Those youth who are acculturated, which means they have adopted the American way of life, 11.8% of those youth report involvement in violence. Comparatively, youth who do not youth who do not have cultural stress, 55% of those youth report no involvement in violence. Here's an example of all those risk factors and protective factors that I just went over, added up or summated. And what you can view here, once again, the risk factors are in the red bars, and the protective factors are in the blue bars. As you can see, you have on the axis the percent of reporting yes of involvement in violence over the number of risk factors or the number of protective factors that each youth has. So as you can see in the blue bars decline, which means the prevalence of violence declines as you increase the number of protective factors, which would be expected. But obviously the converse is true with the red bars. As a youth reports having more risk factors, the involvement in violence increases as well. Shown here in this chart, you have the cumulative risk factor index. So just kind of what I showed you before, where you're adding up risk factors and you're adding up protective factors. You can see that In the first row, cumulative risk factors, the odds ratio is significant. Youth are, have a 30% increased likelihood of reporting violence if for every one risk factor they have. And relative to the cumulative protective factor index, that reduces your likelihood to report violence. And you see at the bottom, I don't have them in colors, age and gender. These models also incorporate in adjustments or controlling for the youth's age and the youth's gender. But what you can see across is following the asterisks for the risk factor index. By itself, the number of risk factors a youth has increases their likelihood of violence. Then when you adjust for age and gender risk factors, the number of risk factors still increase the likelihood of violence. And finally, in the last column is when you control for the number of protective factors that even decrease the likelihood of violence. So what this means is that risk factors alone increase likelihood of violence. Risk factors increase likelihood of violence even above and beyond the benefit you have from protective factors. That's an important distinction there as well. And risk factors, not only are they still mattering when you take into account protective factors, they're also still mattering when you take into account demographics such as age and gender. All right, so that's the empirical study side, the trajectories of delinquency. Now we're moving into, in the risk factors and protective factors, now we're moving into the prevention side. So it's important that prevention be evaluated and considered not by one specific study in one specific country or one specific sample, because not much can be gleaned from one study. It's important to systematically and strategically search through the entire literature, identify all the studies you can identify, and then collectively synthesize and evaluate the robustness or effectiveness of any one particular type of outcome or program. So this was a meta-analysis and a systematic review that I was involved in, where we scoured the literature from 1990 to 2018 to identify all the studies that looked at risk factors among Latino and Latina youth. So we searched over 25,000 records of articles and studies over these roughly 30 years of time, and found studies that were relevant that used over 10 different data sets, and the sample size of these studies ranged from 91 to over 16,000. Ultimately, when you further hone down the studies that were particularly relevant for Latina youth and early life course risk factors, we identified 19 that exactly matched the criteria that we were looking for. And these 19 studies analyzed 144 life course risk factors and demonstrated 533 statistical effects. And what you found were these 5 broader risk factor domains: individual risk factors, which included variables such as gender, smoking, and school performance; peer risk factors, which identified variables such as peer delinquency and drug use; family risk factors or environmental risk factors, which include parental education, immigration status, household composition, and school support; neighborhood risk factors, which included exposure to violence, urbanicity, racial segregation, and neighborhood crime rates; and then finally, ethnic specific cultural risk factors. And this was, first or second generation or beyond immigration status, acculturation, familismo, parent immigration status, Spanish being spoken in the home, and US oriented acculturation. So these were the culmination of the synthesis of risk factors for Latina youth. So now we're looking for prevention intervention programs specifically that could target these risk factors. Similarly, a meta-analysis, a systematic review was conducted where we searched over 7,000 articles and studies throughout the world. We further screened 205 of these for relevance and ultimately determined 78 specific studies that met the criteria. And importantly, this criteria was highly stringent in that we wanted to identify only those studies that had evidence from randomized controlled trials, which is the gold standard for evaluating whether or not studies are in fact, or programs are in fact effective. And what you can see here on the forest plot on the right is the line in the middle is 0, which is we're looking at the distribution of effect sizes. So obviously an effect size of 0 means certainly the program had 0 effect. If you're on the left hand of 0 or the negative side, it means the group that got the program actually did worse than the control group who didn't get the program. If you're greater than 0, it means the group who got the program, experimental program, did better than the group in the control group. And so what you can see here is that across these 78 studies, it's organized by largest positive effect at the top, largest negative effect at the bottom. The overwhelming majority of these studies are greater than 0, meaning that they were positive and favorable to the experimental group who got the program, which in this case, I'm sorry, is early family parent training programs. And the overall mean effect size, which means you aggregate all these 78 studies, you get a mean effect size of 0.35, which falls in the small to moderate range in terms of effectiveness. Or if you want to think about it in terms of recidivism or behavioral problems, you can interpret this that the youth who received the experimental early family parent training program had almost a 2 times less likelihood for having future behavior problems relative to the youth who were in the control group who did not get the experimental program. And here's an example of 3 specific early family parent training programs that were identified largely as being effective and successful from this study. You had the Incredible Years program, which is a worldwide used program. And there's a school-based program. There's a home-based program with parents. It's primarily aimed at training to strengthen a parent's competencies, to not just monitor their children's behavior and recognize when they're doing things wrong, but to also discipline their children's behavior. There's the Triple P parenting program, which I'm sure you all are familiar with because it's incorporated into the Lazos program there in Chile. And it's a multi-systemic, multi-level program that's aimed at training to introduce and promote a parent's use of positive and nonviolent techniques when trying to manage their child's behavior. And then you have parent-child interaction therapy, or PCIT. This is a program that's aimed to train to foster a caring and responsive relationship between the parent and their child. It also involves some curriculum to teach the child to also behave appropriately as well, in addition to the parent training. The other meta-analysis that I've been involved in looking at prevention intervention, particularly in the early life course among youth, relied on looking at self-control improvement programs. So trying to reduce impulsivity and risk-taking behavior and promote positive self-control. Similarly, we looked through over 6,000 studies in this regard. And after further analyzing the studies for relevance, we ultimately end up with 41 studies. Again, importantly, these are 41 studies of programs that use randomized controlled trials, the gold standard in science for evaluating programs. And you can see again on the right, similarly, positive effect sizes mean the youth who were in the self-control improvement programs had less behavior problems, fared better relative to the youth that did not have the self-control improvement program. You can see, just like you saw in the previous study with the family parent training, these self-control improvement programs were largely greater than 0, which means the experimental group fared better than the control group. And the mean effect size here was 0.27, which was fairly comparable to the 0.35 effect size you saw for family parent training. And similarly, means the odds of the youth exhibiting behavior problems that were in the experimental group were about 1.7 times less than the odds of the control group having behavior problems. a few examples of self-control improvement programs. You have the Social Skills Development Program. This is a program that focuses on training to increase the youth's emotional understanding and communication skills, also improve their friendship skills, self-control skills, and social problem solving skills, generally speaking. There's a cognitive coping strategies type of program, which focuses on psychoeducational training and tasks, where children are taught to emit verbalizations that will cue or guide their nonverbal behavior. So the trainer will do an activity and say positive things like, let me think about what I'm going to do next. Let me not do this next time, as they're doing an activity, and then the youth will be asked to model that behavior. You also have videotape training, role play training strategies as well. And this training involves didactic lectures, experiential activities, such as obviously role playing, and then they view videos of child-centered playing for positive and negative exposure to different types of play sessions. And then the other type of option is a relaxation training, which involves meditation, where the children and youth are asked to clear their minds and thoughts and perform deep breathing techniques. All right, so the summary of the presentation today is that Latina youth follow different developmental trajectories of delinquency, as you saw in the analysis from San Juan and from the Bronx in New York. You do find high rate delinquent Latino youth that are a small but a prolific or a group that is involved in a lot of delinquent activities. Then in the structural equation model, you saw that the delinquency trajectories overlap with the victimization and exposure to violence trajectories. And this relationship between victimization and offending still was pronounced even after adjusting for all the additional risk factors. The next study, you saw that risk factors, generally speaking, are distributed across multiple domains, including individual, family, peer, school, biological, neurodevelopmental, and there's also ethnic specific or cultural risk and protective factors. Then you found that it's not just the type of risk factor you have or what domain risk factor a youth may evince, the cumulative nature of risk factors. So the number of risk factors, the number of protective factors, that's what's particularly important in increasing or decreasing the likelihood of violence. And then finally, you saw that the evidence from meta-analyses from randomized controlled trials showed positive and favorable evidence in support of early family parent training programs, and positive and significant evidence in support of self-control improvement programs for reducing delinquency among youth, particularly when these programs are implemented early on in the life course. And here is the citations for these studies that I referenced and showed you analyses from the Brequia Youth study, as well as the meta-analyses that I also referenced in terms of prevention programs at the end of the presentation. And that concludes the presentation. Thank you. Look forward to questions.